Welcome to Agile for Executives. This is the sixth seminar in a series. Agile for Executives is hosted by Agile New England, and I'm Nancy Van Schoenderwart. I'm an independent Agile coach, and I'm also president of Agile New England, and I'm the leader for the Agile for Execs team. And we're really pleased to have completed, well, almost completed the series. Rather than say further, I'm going to turn it over now to my co-host, Carolyn, and she's going to do an intro for us. So, Carolyn, why don't you take it away?
Welcome. So this is our capping session, right? Thank you, everyone who has participated and been with us along this journey. We are so grateful that this topic interests you. And we've spent the past 5 sessions kind of talking about fractal work. The new approach, root to branch. This is a new approach. And it was born into a world shaped by some very painful economic realities. What Julian and Andrew called fractal work was not implemented because they had nothing better to do. They'd been painted into a corner. So as we think about releasing fractal work into the wild, let's just take a minute and nod to the greater context that every single one of us is operating in now. Traditional, functional, and hierarchical business models that succeeded in the past are facing obstacles in 2021. The wild, this model of fractal work is being released into, is constantly changing. There's going to be some Q&A in this session. So before I drop the mic and pass it over to Andrew, who's going to do a quick intro to this final session, try this idea on. What are you seeing in the wild? How could fractal work help you move the needle? What questions, if any, have you hesitated to ask so far that might help everyone? Again, thank you for bringing your best self to this seminar. You matter. You matter. Andrew, Julian, take it away. We're going to stop and have some Q&A at about halfway through today, right, gentlemen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. You got the mic.
Thank you very much, Carolyn and Nancy. Okay, today's a session where we're not going to spend much time reviewing what we did before. And we're going to, I think we've got 25 minutes allocated today. And today's really a day of summary and a day, hopefully, of involving the audience and asking some punchy questions. And the fractal work is a whole system. It's a complete model. So it's really not a patch to an existing structure. And that presents a number of challenges. So I'm going to pass over to Julian to kind of contextualize the reason why we did it. In fact, we were really forced to do it. Julian.
Okay, Nancy, can we have that slide?
Yes, you can.
So
moment.
What I've dug out here is, in the slide you'll see, is 2 photographs of a factory making garments. When we talk about the wild changing, we have to remember we're very context dependent. And for us in 2003, we were entering a crisis of the world around us changing. But I really wanted to show in this slide that what's happening in the Far East, in the slide in the middle picture at the top there, you can see China in 2020. It's a factory making garments. Rows of people with hats on in front of white sewing machines and fluorescent lights. And then back there on the left is a picture from an American factory, the same type in 1950. And what you'll see is the big difference is the sewing machines are black and the lights are incandescent rather than fluorescent. And they haven't got hats on. And really, that's the only difference. There's 70 years between these pictures. I deliberately made the Chinese factory black and white so it looks similar. But really, there's no difference. So when we talk about the model, the world around us changing, it's not the whole world. the models we are comfortable with and familiar with, and we interact with every day, they are alive and well and kicking in the Far East in low labor cost environments. It's not like they've run out of steam. They haven't. What's happened in the West is our labor costs are against us.
So if I can just reiterate that, is that for the traditional organizational model to work, you've got really three conditions you need. One is relatively cheap labor, relatively compliant labor, and it helps if you've got a standardized product. And these are three important conditions that you need for the model to work.
The traditional model.
The traditional model to work.
The one that's been running for hundreds of years in the West.
Yeah.
And those conditions really aren't available now in the West so easily. It's not worth starting up a garment factory in the US. It doesn't make sense. You can't make a pair of jeans for $20 in the US. It's not possible. And if you're going to automate, fantastic. But then why automate in the US? Automate somewhere else. Because the investment's cheaper elsewhere, and then you've only got the transport costs. So the point we're trying to make here is that in the West, we're forced into doing something different because the world around us has dried up, and specifically because of labor costs, and we're competing with low cost labor environments. But in that graphic below there, you can see when you add a dollar sign to each and every place on a traditional hierarchical functional organization, there's a lot of dollars there, and there's a lot of dollars in a group of people who aren't doing productive work. They're managing and they're supervising and they're administrating and they're leading. And really it's that hierarchy of cost which was overbearing for us, and all the add-on impacts it was having as well in terms of our ability to be agile and lean.
So just to pick that up and synthesize that, in the final page, you see some wildebeest. And what that's meant to represent is that fundamentally the grass is gone. In other words, the conditions that the old traditional hierarchical and functional model needs are no longer there. Labor is not cheap by any stretch of the imagination, and there's a factor of 10 and even greater. Secondly, products are not standardized, and people are demanding more bespoke products. They'll accept cheap standardized products, but not expensive standardized products. If products are expensive, they want them bespoke to their own personal needs. And finally, labor isn't compliant. Labor doesn't have to be compliant. So the conditions that we need have really, really changed. The context which we exist in has really, really changed, yet our business model hasn't. And our traditional approach has been to take that model and patch it. So because it's not very lean, we put a lean patch in it. But the fundamental model remains the same. The structure remains the same. The reductionist approach remains the same.
And can I just say that if you think of the children's game Jenga, it's a tower of wooden blocks where you pull out the blocks out of the tower, and hopefully it doesn't fall. And that's the program we've been following for the last 20 years or so, which is to extract costs and waste from our traditional organizations without really reforming them. And our organizations become less robust as a result, and many creaking at the seams and need massive amounts of investment to get back on top of things.
So just to take the analog of our story, so our story, we'd done that. What we had done was we had applied the patch of lean, we applied the patch of agile, then we went into our valley of doom, valley of death moment, and then realized that didn't work. Came out of that, and we had to then do something different. It wasn't a choice. It's nice to think it was a choice, but we didn't have a choice.
So this isn't doom and gloom. This is just saying, look, the world's changing. You know, wildebeest have to face this issue of the grass drying up. So come on, what are we going to do? And what we realized is in order to survive, we had to move up that knowledge chain. We had to employ knowledge workers rather than just handle crankers. And knowledge workers who are producing customized products, they can't. It's not easy to manage those with a very strict conform and compliant hierarchical command and control organization, because so much of what they do is discretionary. You know, and if you upset them, if they get upset, you know, they're going to withhold the very knowledge that is the lifeblood of your organization. So we realized that we needed a new model to suit those people who are higher up in that knowledge economy. We need a new model which had to have low costs, couldn't afford all those dollars. It had to be engaging for those knowledge workers, otherwise they wouldn't contribute their discretionary magic. It had to produce innovation, because the only way we could keep on top of our game was to keep changing. And it had to have high productivity. It had to be able to produce a lot out of what we had, get the best out of what we've got.
So if I can just interrupt there for a bit. So I want to just re-emphasize the importance of structuring your requirements for your model. First of all, when we structured the requirements, and Julian's synthesized them into 4 headings, but obviously it was a bit wider and greater than that. And actually doing a requirements brief for an organizational model was a hugely effective and important part of what we did.
It stopped us choosing bad options, didn't it?
It constrained us in the end to something new, but it was a huge constraint that placed upon our design process.
For example, you can't think about putting people into teams, because when you're trying to nurture engagement from the knowledge worker, you've really got to allow their teams to self-form, so they feel they're voluntary teams rather than imposed teams. They just work a whole lot better. So having these clear distinctions of what that new model had to be like allowed us not to make daft choices. You know, sneak bits of the old model into the new one and then kind of undermine it.
And that didn't mean, by the way, servant-leader relationships. That meant proper self-organizing systems.
Yeah. So our study of organizations led us to 3 options. One is the traditional hierarchy, and we knew we couldn't afford that. So that's one way of getting things done.
So that was out. Done.
I couldn't see how that could work. Even volunteer organizations don't even do well at that. Heterarchies, well, they're more like council-run organizations which are group organizations, and so they often have a council of leaders, a subgroup who make decisions. The problem with them is they really struggle in reaching consensus, and so all the information has to be flooded into that inner circle, and that inner circle then have to make decisions, then command it out. So you haven't really changed the command and control experience on the periphery of the organization. And in addition to that, you run into all the potential problems of that inner council starting to feather their own nest, if that's the right way of putting it, but take advantage of the opportunities that extra power gives them personally.
Possibly more important than that, though, is the different context. So often people come from a reductionist background where they've got a skill in accounts, skill in sales, skill in production, and that's the context they exist in. So when they come to form consensus, they try and do it, but they're heavily swayed within the context of their specialization. And sometimes it's more than likely that a fudge is arrived at. It's not a proper consensus.
So what Andrew's saying there really is that if you've got an accountant and a salesman in a room talking about trying to reach consensus, often there's no common ground to be found because their life experiences are so different. And more often than not, you end up with a polarization of views, and the most powerful person in the room wins out rather than it being the best idea. So the final alternative is responsible autonomy, which is a devolved system, which is more like how our wider economy works. It's a bottom up. People make choices about their purchasing. People make choices about where they shop and what they spend their money on, and it's a way of organizing all the supply chain network in our wider society without having somebody being in command of it. So more like South Korea and less like North Korea.
More like home life, less like work life.
Yeah. But the challenge of that is, well, you know, we know it works in our countries and our economies. The question is how do you bring it into the four walls of your organization? So we wanted a free market within our organization, so individuals could trade, we could have autonomy of individuals, we could measure them in some new way, and it would be the same measure for everybody because we wanted a meritocracy. So in the end, we came up with our system. We experimented a long time, and eventually, you know, we got it up and rolling. Now, since then, and when we've applied it elsewhere, we found it much easier to approach that from a pilot study point of view, where you take a little corner of the business of an organization to create a pilot study, a little corner of an organization which is kind of isolated and whole and complete, and then you populate that with a co-located team. So rather than just being a specialist team to do one thing or another, you have a co-located team where all the functions that small team interacts with the whole organization. You bring members of those teams into it. So now it's like almost like a micro business. That's why we call it a microcosm, because everything in the whole business is going on in that little team. And of course, being co-located allows the accounts and the sales and the operations people to coordinate and choreograph themselves together in one place, in one room, seamlessly, without having to go through channels of emails and stuff like that.
So if I can just interrupt there, and I want to be clear about this, the nature of this team. This team is an autonomous team and has every single function in that team, including strategy, governance, accounts, HR, sales, design, everything you can imagine in the business as a whole is now in that team. And that team acts totally autonomously from the business and the management within that business. They decide, and what they decide, they do. They don't wait or don't have instructions coming from above.
So it'd be a bit like a giant conglomerate, a massive organization which has several different divisions, and each division really operates separately. Everything is separate, and very little. All that gets extracted out of them is usually cash. So there's no instruction from the head office downwards. A little bit. Anyway, so to make this work, to put it on the ground, to say what do you do on Monday morning, we created a simple spreadsheet, a P&L account and balance sheet for the team, for this microcosm, and then we create a P&L and balance sheet for each one of the members of the team, and then the money from the client would flow into that spreadsheet and then flow into the individual spreadsheets as individual members of the team would contribute to a project. And in the end of the month, the idea was that there'd be, you know, the money and work would have been distributed, and the money in each separate spreadsheet would be enough to pay the rent and the taxes and the lighting and the tea and coffee and the labor costs of the individual, as well as generating a profit.
So that's an important part that you mentioned, because in terms of the microcosm has to pay for the infrastructure that it uses. So not only the space that it uses, but the equipment it uses, the computers that it uses, everything in terms of this stewardship model, yeah, all the resources have to be paid for by the microcosm. Yeah.
So what we do is we get rid of the idea of hours. we'd stop having a currency of hours in the organization. So we'd have a commitment to do as contract. We'd throw that into the team, and the team would then unpick that in terms of the value of the contract and distribute it between themselves with an eye on the value that each member was going to do rather than the hours it was going to take. So the quicker they did it.
So an analogy for that is a wolf pack. The wolf pack hunt as a group, but eat as an individual. And we were trying to use that analogy, hunting as a group, eating as an individual in our teams. So there was a sharing out of value at the end of the month. And sometimes it posed a lot of questions. If there wasn't enough value, enough resources coming into the group, then there wasn't enough to share out. Potentially that could cause some conflict.
So initially we had problems with people being a bit naive about how to do things and kind of going a little bit rogue in terms of their willingness to work with other people, thinking it was now a dog eat dog type thing. And that usually takes a little time for the team to mature and realize that they can achieve so much more if they collaborate than if they work as individuals. But having said that, even if working as individuals, it's better to have a profitable and high value individual than it is to have a loss-making team. So then once we would have our team running for a few months, 3 or 4 months, and we'd start to be able to integrate all sorts of maintenance and all sorts of the wider aspects of the organization, the demand of the rest of the organization. And we'd work out how they could trade with each other seamlessly. Then once you've got that functioning nugget, it's then easy to then duplicate that and replicate it. And instead of the team members trading between them, now you're having whole teams trading between themselves as well. And that increases the size of the projects and the diversity which you can bring in. And individuals can move from team to team. Suddenly it gets much more fluid, much more dynamic, and we see big benefits.
So can I just interrupt there, because somebody asked a very good question, and that is, what's the optimum size of a team? And we did a lot of experimentation around this, and obviously we ended up in a team of 1, and we discussed why, because of the Ringelmann effect. But actually we started off with larger teams than that. But essentially what it boiled down to, if the team exceeds the size of a large family, it soon breaks down. So by the maximum we really considered was 7. And after that, it really started to get complicated as the network effect. There's a little formula which starts with an N, which is the number of people in the team, open brackets, N minus 1 divided by 2. And that's the number of nodes in the network. And that expands exponentially. So as the team expands, so that expands. And the size of the team, which for me was the optimum size of a team, was dependent on the functionality that was brought to bear. So example, the first team we formed, we needed to have a salesperson in it, an accounts person in it, we had to have a purchasing person in it, and that dictated the size of the team, because we were operating or shifting from a reductionist model. But of course, as we got multi-skilled, the teams could get smaller and smaller and smaller, and we got the benefit from the kind of inverse Ringelmann effect as people get multi-skilled. So I hope that answers that question. No more than 7.
And then we saw big benefits in these teams. The members become more and more engaged, and then we'd see innovation taking place, and we'd see things like more communication with customers, with the clients at the design phase, so that they were absolutely clear during the design phase with the customer what they were going to make. And if they couldn't make something, they'd be communicating with the clients. They were making the sales process now integrated the production process. It wasn't just design for manufacturing, it was also sales for manufacturing.
And accounts for manufacturing.
Exactly that. And we saw such a change in the success of the teams. And we've applied this model to lots of different types of organizations. We applied it to a farm, and again, down to teams of one, but then they collaborate together. And we took a market farm from a loss-making organization to a profitable one, doing CSA type boxes. A printing organization, again, traditional organization, loss-making. IT service companies, right through to construction. And it's all about getting the engagement of the people on the ground rather than just being compliant and conforming. Because in the knowledge industries, that's not enough. Cranking a handle doesn't work in the knowledge industry.
Can I just take a little caveat here? And particularly, I was pointing at the printing example here. They had a centralized IT system. So it was like an ERP system, which you could consider like Microsoft Dynamics, SAP, and such like. And of course, in a bottom-up system, that's not what you want. But of course, when the management said, well, we want all these centralized reports, it was starting to cause quite a conflict between what the team wanted, the autonomous team wanted, and what the management wanted at the top. Because the autonomous team didn't want the software, didn't want to use the software that was being forced upon them. They wanted different sort of software. They wanted bottom-up software that they could amend to meet their customers' needs. And of course, this caused quite a challenge in the printing industries because the management team said, no, you've all got to use the same software. And that conflict is slowly being resolved, but it's quite a challenge.
But they haven't got, there's pressure on them because the while that they're operating is changing. There's many more online printers and print-on-demand organizations which have got lower prices. And when you look into them, open the box and go visit them, they've got lower costs as well. So we've got to change. So we ended up with a model then, which was self-organizing, had an internal free market to allow people to trade discretionary between each other. We didn't have to train any new things. When we had a co-located team, it was obvious what the demands were on the finances, on the sales, on the purchasing. All these things were within the organization, within the team, so team members could easily see what other people were doing. Purchasing, for example, well, people do purchasing at home when they go shopping, don't they? So it's not a new skill they had to learn. We just had to make sure our processes were neat and slick so that they could be operated by anybody. We could scale that from a small team to a large team to a big project to a small project. It didn't really matter the size of the product or project you were working on, just as because you can subcontract anything. The model then was easy to replicate. We didn't have to bring any language. In fact, the language we introduced was say to the salesman was production language. Well, that's quite useful for a salesman to know production language, to know the problems of production. It's quite useful for the production people to know about finance. It's quite good for the bookkeeper to know about project management. All these multi-skills were all available and really benefited everybody from increasing their skills.
Now, I'm conscious of time because Carolyn and Nancy's going to start waving their hands. But I just want to kind of conclude this session, a call to action. And there are really three simple things that I want to communicate. One is that stop iterating, and stop patching, and start innovating. Because the solution that we found did not lie in iterating and improving the old model. We had to make a significant shift.
Stop putting the blocks out of your Jenga tower with an effort to success, because it's only going to lead to one destination.
It's also true to say that, and I think the UK is probably in an unhealthier state, than America, but certainly in the UK, the time is right. And it was a question of migrate or die. So it wasn't an option for us. We had to do something which was radical. And bear in mind also, our market sector was in decline. Whereas if you take a sector where I know a lot of Agile people are in, they're in the software sector. Now that's just starting a decline as it migrates to India. But we were well down that line in the aerospace industry. Yeah, and we were a very mature industry and it was consolidating heavily. And I'm going to leave you with this final thing is that, if you do want to do something new, the question I ask and pose to you guys is, how can we help you? How can we help to transition the way we think about business from rather, piloting the aircraft to designing the aircraft, from changing the way we think from a pilot's viewpoint to a designer's viewpoint? Now, I think that's the end of our session now. And I know Karen and Nancy want to leave some time now for questions from the audience. And this is a bit of I think a free range session. So I hand back to Nancy and Karen.
Yeah, it's a free range question. We don't have very many things in the chat, and there was one about size of the autonomous teams, but you've responded to that already. So I'll just say, does anybody else have a question that you'd like to ask verbally? Just go ahead and do the little hand raise thing so I can see who and invite you to unmute.
And I have a point of clarification. So you alluded to this a few times. When you're picking a pilot, is it critical to have that pilot be focused on a customer?
Yeah,
say something about that.
Yes, it's tempting to do it with as a sort of internal transaction, but in fact, it's so much better if the money flows from outside to inside. And so I would thoroughly recommend, if you're going to do pilot, you look at a product or a service that is being supplied and which you can then take directly from customer all the way through, through the working capital cycle.
So let me put some meat on that. So if you did say maintenance, okay, it's an internal service in an organization. So, well, there's a nice isolated team, we could do a project with them. But the problem is usually maintenance is priced cost plus. So if the maintenance team were to make savings, it's quite logical then for the rest of the organization to say, well surely now we should give them less. We should give them less money.
Yeah.
So it rather shoots the maintenance department in the foot if they improve things, because they'll just have their budgets cut. Whereas if the money's coming from outside, if it's a paid client, it's a client paying the organization for a project, then the client just wants to be happy and they're happy to swap the money for the project.
So it's not cost plus pricing, it's market pricing.
Yeah. So
they price to the market price, and as they improve their efficiency, so their profitability improves and they're seeing the benefit.
So they keep the money. The budget's not cut next year, let's put it that way. So I would suggest having an external client and not an internal one.
Any other questions? Comments?
Yes, we have one from David. David, come on in.
There. Please stop me if it has been addressed in the session. I missed a few and I'm still trying to catch up on my videos. I have completely loved the content and taken it on board. And I was chatting to a CTO the other day about how we might do this in the organization. And this is a software development organization, and they do quite a lot of new product development. And his first question is, what sort of companies has this worked in, or have we worked in? And you've answered that now to a degree. But the question is then, where and how do we find budget for the innovation, the risk-taking, when a lot of this sort of leads to optimization of delivery of existing? How do we put a line item behind taking a whole new stab at something?
Yes, okay, so I think I can answer that. I'll have a go. So part of the model we have is that you've got It's a virtual company you set up, and it has virtual shares and a virtual shareholders, and it has a virtual debt as well. So in a startup, yeah, you're going to have to finance. There's only two places money can come from. One is investor, the other is customer. If you don't have a product that you can sell to the customer, the only money that can come into the virtual company is via investors. So the question then is it via equity or is it via debt? Or in our case, virtual equity or virtual debt? Because remember, it's a fractal of the real world. So all of our virtual companies have shareholders and have, in effect, debt.
I should just add in a little bit here, P. David, that in our model, the teams and individuals will make a profit. And 20% of that profit, a fifth of it, they take home as a bonus. A fifth of it goes to the tax man, because that's corporation tax. You pay on your profits. And a fifth of it goes to me and Andrew, tick in the box. But that leaves 40%. That leaves 2/5. 1/5 goes into a community pot for things like common investment, for example, telephone system or a website, something like that. And the other one goes into their personal investment pot, which gives them a fund to speculate with. The only thing is it must be in a future investment. So it could be product, it could be stock, it could be advertising, it could be anything like that, which has a future return on it. And when Andrew's talking about shares and stuff, what happens is somebody in the organization can raise the idea of a speculative venture, a new product, something that they think they can sell, and then they can go around and lobby their colleagues for some of this investment pot money.
And potentially they can start up another virtual company for the purpose of doing that speculative investment.
Yeah.
And employ somebody into it to do it.
And so we've got this internal discretionary funds, which each member then can speculate on different things and use it. But it can't be extracted as salary. It has to be extracted via investment, ideally a return by selling things to customers. So hopefully that answers your question. In our organization now, there's people with more than $100,000 in their personal investment pots that they've got they've deployed in different ways. And I should say for us, for Andrew and I, we charge them interest on that capital as well. So they have to deploy it because it sort of burns a hole in their pocket. So we're trying to get them to be entrepreneurial and deploy it. What we found initially was they're far more conservative than we were. We were willing to speculate, but our members of staff weren't. They'd rather just say, oh, look, I'll just take the safe option. So we then would charge them more and more as a percentage every year for the capital they were just sat on. And that forces them to use it, to deploy it in some way.
Yeah, so thank you very much. That does, I think the first part about thinking about the small business as a startup itself that could get funding really helps. The thing is here, the greater business is a startup, which has received funding. So a lot of its thinking is also around, most of the spending is in fact those discretionary pots. When you mentioned giving people capital and then spending it down, does that mean that if you spend your money, you've implicitly no longer have that capital, or do you have like a loan against it now? Or if you spend it, you've made money for it? I don't understand how I get rid of my loan by spending my money.
Well, you don't, first of all, get rid of the loan sum. The loan sum carries on, unfortunately for you, unfortunately for the banker. So the idea is that 20% of the profit goes into the investment account. And then if they use that investment account, in effect, or swap, let's say they start up another cell or another virtual company, they would swap asset cash for asset virtual company shares,
which would pay a dividend,
which would then pay a dividend, and that they would then get a large percentage of the profit, well, depending on, of course, on the number of shares they've got.
So let's imagine the reason why they still want our capital is because they deploy it for 20% and they pay us 10. So that's why they wouldn't want to pay it off.
So my dream, by the way, in the longer term, is to have an internal stock market. That's my ultimate dream. So that mimics the outside world inside the organization. So I'm hoping in the next 5 years, we will have an internal trading platform so people can trade shares within the virtual company, within the boundaries of the statutory company.
But to go back to your point, David, to go back to your question, David, however you choose to do this, at the moment you're doing it in an organization, at the moment somebody's making these discretionary decisions. And we found it better to spread those decision making out and devolve it rather than having one person betting the farm on what they thought was going to win. And I like it a lot because the best opportunities are available with customers and clients, and the teams are actually in contact with them on a daily basis, and so they see the opportunities better than we would.
And do you know what our greatest problem is? Our greatest problem is to get people to invest and not just to take it as a P&L hit.
Yeah.
So they'll do things which are clearly investable, and they'll just take it into their P&L. And they go, well, don't do that. Use the investment pot, create a vehicle to invest in, grow it. And once they get the hang of that, they start to say, oh, this is fun. So and some of them, they don't have to work every day now. So they can say, well, that's an income I've got, unearned income which I've got. And they really just then start to see the benefit
of being entrepreneur.
Of being an entrepreneur. Rather than just a handle turner.
That's your question, David.
We have, does that answer your question in full, David? Wonderful. I'm going to take Gaurang Shah. I hope I'm saying your name properly. Come on in.
Yes, thanks, Gaurang Shah. Twofold question, I guess. One is more around, you guys did an excellent job kind of explaining the evolution. Timing-wise, until the very end, I kind of had it, I thought, in terms of so the first 6 months, and then last session, I believe you explained the 18 to 24 month where that roundabout the marketplace started evolving. From that point on to the individual being the kind of the sole enterprise within your org star, what was that journey in terms of timeline purely, and then the impetus that led to the autonomous teams evolving to autonomous individuals? Was that very formal and thought through and prescriptive, or was that a natural evolution based on how things were optimizing?
So I'm going to answer that. So the timeline was, I'm going to say three or 4 years, and of course we'd implement that quicker now because we were still stumbling around in the dark to a large degree. But devolving down to one person was really a process of us saying, okay, we've got sales which are being successful, and we've got ones which are being unsuccessful. And we followed a simple program of saying, right, an unsuccessful team will split into two. And that would be half the members in each. And then they trade between them. And what we found is often one half was successful and the other half was the one which was carrying the losses. So we'd say, okay, well, we sort of halved the problem. We hadn't halved the losses, but we'd certainly got some people over here who we could just let go, and they'd be completely comfortable in the system, and they'd start going better and better. So now we were targeting down on where our problems lay, and even then, when we had even with a cell of two, we'd still find when we split it, the problems went this way and the success went that way. So we had an example of where one of the people in our place was special police officer, a voluntary police officer, and in the evenings he'll be in the town centre. And the woman he worked with had an errant teenager son. And when the son was doing something he shouldn't be doing in the town centre, and this volunteer policeman would come across him, he'd take him back home rather than down to the police station. In return, the woman did all his work at work. Now, look, you'll never unpick those sort of. Look, there's people having affairs in workplaces. There's all sorts of complicated real world
Social dynamics.
Dynamics that are going on in organizations. You can't unpick them. But as you separate people, so you suddenly find these things that occur and appear. And what happened was, as we separated those two, the woman was perfectly happy in the situation. She had to do less work in the future because she didn't have to support him. And he went off to become a policeman.
So it was win-win.
So we won all round there.
And so did she, and so did he.
Yeah.
So it's not really fair to say that there was a loser in it all.
Yeah.
He got a better job that more suited him.
He wanted to do it.
He wanted to do it. She got a much better job because she wasn't encumbered anymore, and the business did better.
Yeah.
We have one more question, and then I know Nancy, do you want to go ahead?
Thanks.
So the next question is coming in from Marcus. Marcus, I'm going to give you the opportunity to unmute if you'd like to.
Sure.
It's totally up to you.
All right. Yeah, I'm interested to hear, you talked about how people they kind of invest and they can put a whole bunch of money that's in the company. What happens when somebody then chooses to leave and they've got initiatives in progress that were just in their cell, or they've got all these investments that are sort of tied up in the company? How do you decide?
Really good question.
That's a good question. I'll answer that one. So when somebody leaves, it's like they're going through a liquidation process. So in effect, their cell is liquidated, and the remaining people in the organization, there's an auction for the assets of that cell. And so people bid for the assets, and the assets then that are received go on to pay any liabilities, and any money that's left over is then distributed to the shareholders or to the virtual shareholders. So exactly the same thing happens inside the organization, the virtual companies, as happens outside the organization. And that includes for going through any creditor agreements. Everything that happens in any sort of insolvency is the same inside as outside.
And that I should say straight away, we started off with a problem that people didn't want to take on extra work, and years later, after we put our systems in place, when somebody left, there was this big auction. People were bidding and bidding and bidding on the stock and the equipment and the recipes for the jobs and the contacts with the clients and the tools and equipment and the IT, and everything was swept up, and the bones were pecked clean, as it were. And we'd end up then with a bunch of capital that would allow the individual to pay the holiday, the accrued, everything that paid for all that. So
it's a bizarre, just to summarize that, so bizarrely we ended up in the old days, when we had an old model, we had to push the work onto other people, and kind of force them to do it. And now there's like piranha fish eating a skeleton. It was just incredible. Yeah, we'll have that. Thanks very much. No, it was such a change. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well,
that's how we do it.
That's a great note to wrap up on, isn't it?
Again, I just want to reiterate, it's just how the outside world works. That's all we did. We copied that. We didn't invent anything.
That's fascinating. Okay, I'm going to share screen for a moment here. And what I want to do is, first of all, just to say to all of you, Andrew and Julian have told me they're really impressed by the great questions that our audience has been asking all throughout the seminar. I'd like to briefly show you the recommended resources here that are in the book. Recommended resources from Andrew and Julian. There's several books here, and if Carolyn would help by putting these things in the chat window, that'll make it easy for the attendees to just grab them. But viewers later will be able to get the information from this slide. There's also an excellent video from Russ Akoff describing systems thinking that we think is really helpful here too. So I'll leave this up for a moment, and I would ask you a little quick feedback question for us. Thinking back on the seminar series, let me ask you this question, and just do the hand raise if your answer is yes. Would you agree that the content of this series of seminars has been better than expected? And if so, just click on the hand raise. Well, if you go on the hand raise, then it'll show up on my panel and I can get a vote count. Is that okay? That would be helpful. So thank you very much for clicking on that. I'm just going to pause my sharing for a moment so that I can see the results. And oh, super, super, very good. Thank you. So this is the end of our sessions. We would also like to think about whether to do more things on these topics. So I'm also going to invite you by Carolyn putting something in the chat. You could write something here in chat if you'd like, but what you can also do, I'm going to come back to the screen shares for anybody who didn't get the books. If you'd like to say something here, you can do a private reply in the chat. You can reply to the Agile New England item if you look at the drop down in the chat for who you're messaging instead of everyone. You can pick that. And you can just give a comment that you would like, because we're really interested in what you think, and we're really interested in understanding what appetite there is for Agile New England to do further events of this type, or on this topic with Andrew and Julian, and learn more from the experiences they've had. That would be fascinating for us. Alternately, there's an email address that you can also send comments to, which Carolyn is putting in chat now, right, Carolyn?
Not yet. It'll go.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So if you would make note of those things, we'll also send out some type of survey questions to you. That would help us a lot, because we're trying to figure out what the appetite is for this type of information. So thank you very much. And let me just come to my next slide here to wrap up. There aren't any further seminars, but we had this weird idea that people might find value just in the book and the set of videos. So we're going to leave our registration open until the end of this month. If you have colleagues or other people who you think would really benefit from learning more about this, please refer them. They can just come and register, from our website the same way you registered, agilenewengland.org. And as before, there's the info here about our public Slack that is available. You can go to agilenewengland.org and you can sign up there to discuss further in our public Slack. And that's it. That wraps it up for this seminar. I just want to thank everybody for coming.